be talking about a lot of different topics. Next hour, we will, of course, get into the Democratic debates, although I'll have a little bit later this hour to say a few things about that. But I just wanted you to know that if you find yourself while wanting to get into another topic, this is going to be a day in which we have 4 different guests over 3 hours. So it's going to be really packed with all sorts of great interviews and information. And we are privileged to have in studio with us today Senator Angela Paxton, of course, representing the Senate District 8, individual that, of course, graduated from Baylor University with degrees in math, as well as a background with a master's degree from University of Houston in the area of education. And she knows math and physics and computers and all sorts of things. And also, of course, knows the political realm very well. Of course, married to the Attorney General, Ken Paxton. And it is great to have you in studio.
Well, Kerby, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks.
And one of the things I thought we'd do before we get into all the issues is I noticed that you had a post on Facebook about an individual that many of us know, and many of our listeners here in the Dallas area probably would know, and that's Debbie Terry. And then after I thought maybe we'd talk about that, I noticed Penna Dexter, who will be here tomorrow sitting in that chair, when we do our roundtable, our Friday weekend edition, she actually did a commentary that went out to the entire nation, which we'll talk about tomorrow on Debbie Terry. And I think it's just an opportunity to talk about some individuals that have really given their lives, as you have, as your husband has, to try to make the culture and the political scene better. And if nothing else, I'd love to get your thoughts about Debbie Terry.
Well, I'm going to miss Debbie. Debbie was a very special lady. I guess, I'm 56 years old, and I'm at a time in my own life where, when you go to a funeral or a wedding or there's the birth of a child, these major milestones in life, from the very beginning to the very end, and they do cause you to pause and kind of take an account of your own life.
That's
and
for sure.
Are you making a difference? And I'll tell you, being there last Monday to celebrate Debbie's life with so many friends, looking around the room and seeing the people who had gathered there, she influenced influencers. And of course, her husband, Tim, and her family, our hearts go out to them as they will be adjusting to not having her physically present with them. And heaven becomes more real when someone you love goes to heaven. And I remember experiencing that myself with both of my parents as well. But, I guess some of the thoughts, about Debbie, she was a dear friend. She was such an encourager. She was an encourager to me and to Ken. And Ken actually gave one of the eulogies.
Yes, I heard.
Did a beautiful job, and he talked about that, about how she had been such an encourager to us and to so many. She was one of the founders of Golden Corridor Republican Women, which is my home club, and that again is a group of women who are influencers. And she started the Legislative Prayer Caucus in Austin, again, ministering to and influencing influencers.
Yes.
And I'm glad to know that you'll be visiting about her tomorrow, because you could do a whole show and then some on Debbie Terry. But, I guess I just kind of thought about, in fact, I told Tim as we said goodbye to him before we left after the service, I felt like that service was a commissioning. And in fact, the family gave out batons. You may have heard about that. And they said, today, Debbie passes the baton to you.
Very good.
And I have one of those, and I have it in my office, my district office here up in Allen. But it really was a commissioning. And I guess the big idea, big thought that I left with was this that was said about Debbie. Debbie always remembered where the real battle was, and that it was a spiritual battle. And that our prayer must be accompanied by our action. And in fact, anything you really believe, you won't keep inside. I mean, there'll be action attached to that, right? And that's, we see that in the book of James. Don't just be hearers, be doers. And
Right.
they go together when they're real. And anyway, but I really have been pondering that thought, how she kept first things first, and she always remembered where the real battle was. It is not against flesh and blood.
Mm-hmm.
And that if we are not waging war on our knees, then, our actions they're just temporal actions.
Yeah.
And anyway, I thought a lot about that. And I certainly want my service to be marked by that, that inward stand, in my inner world, in my personal life with Christ. And, so that it can be effective for the kingdom of God in the ways that really matter.
Well, again, just a great legacy and a role model. And, of course, first time I ever met her was at one of the studios of Point of View, because Marla Maddox had gathered some people together, and there she was. And I met her for the first time. And last time I saw her was at an event you and I were both at, in which Jonathan Saenz, who's on the program with us sometimes, had done an event, and she was there. So I just wanted to mention that. Again, we'll talk about that tomorrow with Penna Dexter, but let's get into a couple of things. We were looking forward to property tax reform. Tell us how we've been able to make some changes in our property tax codes.
Well, that was certainly, I think we had a very narrowly focused session.
Mm-hmm.
It was clear to me, it was clear to every senator that I talked to that we were really sent with orders to do something about property taxes and school finance and education. Those were the big items, and that's really where we did spend a lot of energy and effort. And the property tax piece has two parts to it: reform and relief.
Right.
And so there was a lot done to reform the process. One of the things that was so critical was to get a handle on how fast our property tax rates have been escalating, right?
Yep.
Most people are very aware that, and most people will find it if they look at their property tax bills, that their school portion is the largest portion. And so it was very clear that, we fund our schools with our property taxes in Texas. And so the education bill and the property tax bill were very, very connected. But we did some major reforms, and we also were able to put a lot of money toward relief. We were able to cut recapture Robin Hood, which is a very big problem here in my district, in half almost.
Well, we're going to take a break, and of course we want to talk about that education part, because you are a former teacher and certainly did some things that I think are going to be very important to talk about. H.R. 72 was one of your bills, as well as the whole issue of education reform. So we'll talk about all that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The debate and discussion about transgender issues will continue because of a transgender ideology that is developed that is actually harmful to kids. That is one of the conclusions of the book by Ryan Anderson with the creative title When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. The transgender ideology promotes the opportunity for children to change their gender with surgery and drugs, and parents are told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. Ryan Anderson counters that the best studies of gender dysphoria have found that between 80 and 95% of children who express a discordant gender identity will come to identify with their bodily sex if natural development is allowed to proceed. He goes on to document that even children going through transitioning treatment still have an extraordinarily high rate of suicide attempts compared to the general population. It reminds us that we should be tolerant and loving towards children and adults who struggle with their gender identity. But we should also be aware of the potential harm when transgender identity is normalized. Unfortunately, we are living in a world where transgender activists want more than tolerance and kindness. They demand affirmation. We aren't allowed to question whether using medical treatments to aid in transgender transformation is positive for children. In his new book, Ryan Anderson shows that the best biology, psychology, and philosophy support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality. As he puts it, biology isn't bigotry. I hope the American people will trust the best scientific evidence and not reject it in favor of the transgender ideology. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, and we are talking in studio today with Senator Angela Paxton representing Senate District 8. And Angela, let me come to you because I remember candidate Angela Paxton made a big point about the fact that I'm a teacher. Education is kind of my issue. And as you pointed out just a minute ago, when you had the governor set forth the principles and the very important priorities, education was one of those. And education reform is one of those topics I thought we might talk about for a few minutes.
Well, and, the education piece is very tied to because of school finance, is very tied to property tax reform. And so it made sense to kind of tackle those together. In fact, I don't know that you really can tackle either of them separately.
Yeah.
And, as we were just talking about property taxes, one of the things we did, with the place where we'll see the most impact is in our school taxes, because that's the biggest portion. For the first time in, I believe it's around 48 years, we lowered what's called the rollback rate. We actually are calling it the voter-approved rate, that now taxing entities other than hospitals and schools have to get voter approval to increase more than 2.5% from 8%.
Right.
But for 48 years, it was at 8%. Now, and for schools and hospital districts, it's 3.5%. So there's a lot more transparency, I think. We were able to, that will be filled in with state funding to replace some of the Robin Hood recapture, again, which is such a difficult thing for our district in particular. So, the school finance formula, they went in and did we went in and did major adjustment for the first time in a long time. One of the things that's changed a lot is the fact that the fastest growing demographic is the poverty demographic in Texas schools. You can think about it what you want, but if we do not address that, these students who traditionally are not high performing because of a number of reasons.
If they come to school hungry and they don't have any parental involvement, you know where it's going to take you.
I was proud to serve on the education committee. So thankful to get to do that. I'm the first educator elected to the Senate in 25 years.
That's what I was thinking.
And I was able to serve on property tax committee as vice chair, and then on the education committee, and bring that perspective of a classroom teacher. It was important, and I was able to carry some legislation as well. But it's very important. One of the things that we know is that academic achievement, the two big determining factors of high academic achievement, are great teachers and engaged parents.
Right.
And so I think there's a growing recognition by our schools that, they've got to do more to engage parents, help parents who maybe are intimidated. Parents want their kids to do well, but they don't always have confidence in how to support their kids. And so that's a place we've got to work. But one of the things we can do is we can help, by attracting, retaining, keeping our great teachers up to date so they want to stay in the profession.
Paying them more?
Paying them more. And so we
Which
were
you
able
did.
to secure a pay raise, a well-deserved pay raise for teachers.
Right.
I've got 2 daughters that are going to both be teachers. And, we want to keep great teachers in the classroom. One of the other things that we were able to do, for teachers really for such a long time, the only way to increase their compensation was really to move out of the classroom. It was to move up into administration or
That's
something
true.
like that.
That's very true.
And so we're now we have ways so that we can keep great teachers in the classroom where they want to stay.
Yeah, you want a master teacher there.
Exactly.
Not leaving. Yeah. Good
Exactly.
point.
So that was very important. Another one of the bills that I carried was to relieve schools of unfunded mandates, particularly things that aren't even related to academic achievement, like what kind of light bulbs we use in schools. And that was based on the great work of the TEA work group that went through the education code and just things that are obsolete, things that aren't tied to academic achievement, but the state was saying you have to do this, you have to do this. And you know what? If it's not related to student achievement, school districts will maximize their efficiency better than us telling them what light bulb to use or not to use.
Yeah.
So those were important things.
I did want to talk about adoption because you have a heart for that, and you can explain why. But HB 72 is a bill that you brought to the floor and were able to get passed.
Yeah, HB 72 was an important bill. I worked on that with Representative James White in the House, and pro-life issues are important to me. I'm an adopted child myself. And actually, my kids are very engaged in pro-life activities as well in college and out in the community. It's been important to our family for a long time. And, as a pro-life person, though, I may define it a little differently than I've heard some people talk about. To me, pro-life is about the dignity of human life, protecting the dignity of human life. And so it's not just adoption, abortion, those kinds of issues. It's also end of life. It's also people with disabilities,
right.
Foster children, and human trafficking. That's another, to me, a life issue. But yeah, what HB 72, what that did really was to address children with disabilities in the foster care system. Children with disabilities are disproportionately represented in the foster care system, which is a sad commentary in and of itself. But we do know that one of the things that really makes a difference is to help kids that are foster kids be adopted kids, right? Well, one of the impediments to that for many families was the health care issue for foster children with disabilities. It financially very, very difficult to adopt those children and then incur those extra costs. And so there was an incentive to keep those children as foster children and not adopt them. So what this bill really did was it provided some coverage for those families to make it easier to adopt those children, which is a much better long-term stable environment for the kid and for their well-being.
One other one I thought I'd just mention before I let you go, the whole issue of religious liberty, because that's one that we talked about a lot with Jonathan Saenz as well. Of course, Matthew and others have been part of that as well. But that was one that I noticed you mentioned. And, of course, that's close to your heart and also, of course, to your husband's heart as well.
It really is. And, of course, Chick-fil-A is close to everyone's heart and stomach, right?
Good line.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But, my husband's office actually, the eat more chicken, the cow and everything.
Yeah.
And there's a sign that I saw was produced by, I think, Ken's folks on his end of things. And it has the cow holding a sign and it says, "Read more Constitution."
Oh, great line.
But yeah, the city of San Antonio actually had denied a contract for Chick-fil-A to have a store in the San Antonio airport. And that's what kind of really opened the door. Of course, this is bigger than Chick-fil-A or any one business.
Yeah.
But that bill was carried by
Matthew
by
Krause.
Brian Hughes.
Yeah,
and,
Brian Hughes. Yeah, the other bill. That's
in
right.
the Senate.
Mhm.
And anyway, but it allows for protection.
Right.
Just because of your religious affiliation, you can't be denied things because of your affiliation with other religious groups.
Yes. Well, I just thought it was a great idea. And of course, you and your husband have always been fighting the human trafficking issue, which we also talked about as well. But I thought I'd, just before we run out of time, mention that we do have a link to your website, so that if somebody says, I'd like to contact her, or I'd like to know more about some of these bills, or I'd like to express my opinion about some of the things, or find out what's happened in the legislature, we've made that link. But talk about human trafficking. We only have about 30 seconds, but I'd love to get some thoughts about where you see that going, especially with what your husband's doing right now.
Well, one of the things, we want to send a very clear message that if you engage in human trafficking, that you are going to pay a very, very high price.
Yes.
And it is not worth your time to exploit other people for financial gain. And so, his office has a task force. We passed, and I actually was one of the joint authors on the omnibus human trafficking bill in the Senate. It is a great evil, and we don't need to just reduce it. We need to eliminate it.
Yes. Well, again, if you'd like to know a little bit more about some of the things that Senator Angela Paxton has been doing, representing the Senate District 8, but I know you listen to people from other districts as well. We have a link to the website, and that is just an opportunity for you to get to know a little bit more about her, some of the legislative actions. And the legislature is not in session, but I know we're going to be hearing more about some of the things you've been doing in the future. So thank you for coming to the program today.
Well, thanks, Kerby, and thanks for the opportunity to connect with your listeners. I am listening. This is why I'm here, to listen, to learn, to lead. And it starts with listening to my constituents, and ends with leading and making good policy for our state. And I depend on feedback from my constituents and people all across the state that have similar values.
Let me just say that if there's something you've heard here and you say, I'd like to pass this on to someone else, of course, we've made it possible for you to download the podcast and send it to someone, or watch it on YouTube. That's all available as well. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute. And if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151. Or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, and if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Might just mention that, of course, we've had Senator Angela Paxton on, and that has been certainly very helpful, and love to hear from her, and we'll probably have her on again. I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a program note for a few minutes here. We've got kind of open lines, and David Geisler will be with us at 1 o'clock today. A tribute to Norm Geisler, but also a documentary coming out about his father, a book coming out, and maybe even an update on a few things happening at some of these seminaries that were started by Dr. Norm Geisler. So we'll be talking about that. Then at 1:30, I thought, well, it's time to get into the Democrat debate. So for a while, we'll be talking with our friend Dr. Merrill Matthews, and he can certainly provide a perspective on two of the biggest topics last night in the Democrat debate. One of those, which was the whole issue of health care reform. Probably one of the leading experts in the country, as Dr. Merrill Matthews has written so much about this and understands the ins and outs of it. And then more recently, he's really learned a lot about the whole issue of energy. And so he's going to also probably help us with the other big issue that was in the debates last night, and that's the issue of climate change. There's a third issue, which I'll kind of cover after he is gone, and that's the issue of immigration. There are some really important points I want to bring out on that regard. So those are all issues we will be talking about. And I recognize that many of you can only hear the first 2 hours of our program. The third hour is national. And so in that last half hour, we will certainly cover some of that. But then in the first hour at 2 o'clock, we'll kind of have an open line. I'll get into some of those issues of immigration. And then I thought, by that time, everybody's probably tired of talking about politics. Probably I am, if nothing else. And there was just a very good piece that it was in the Daily Article, which is normally written by Jim Dennison. Well, Jim Dennison's son, Ryan Dennison, is writing this week, and he wrote one about this whole issue of the ancient Apostles' Church. And since we've spent a fair amount of time on a number of different occasions talking about archaeology, and in particular how archaeology is really verifying the Bible, this last year, 2018, was a banner year for archaeology in terms of really confirming biblical facts and history. And now they believe they have found the Church of the Apostles, the church that was actually established by Peter, most likely in his own home, which is right by the synagogue where Jesus preached all the time, is in Capernaum. But if you go to Bethsaida, this is possibly the Church of the Apostles, which is actually recorded as late as the 8th century. So, first of all, Ryan Dennison has a Ph.D. in church history, so he'll give us a little bit of that history, but also some of the archaeology, and it would be kind of interesting as we close out the program today. So that gives you an idea of the next 2.5 hours, and I'm looking forward to all of it. Let me just mention that we've posted a couple of articles. One of the first ones is how expensive all this free stuff is. It's entitled The Cost of Free Stuff, and it is on our website. And this is an article that I think you would find helpful, which actually is not only one of the articles that comes from this particular research by Sons of Liberty, but also quotes a significant amount from World Net Daily. So really, it's kind of a compendium of material. But when you talk about how expensive all of this is going to be, I'll save the other article on some of the people running the numbers on how expensive the Green New Deal will be. But this one kind of looks at it in a bigger sort of way and looks at the kind of expenses that are being suggested, because you have, for example, Joe Biden, who was on the program last night, wants to triple the amount of money spent for Title I schools. Well, that's $32 billion. Wants to create a universal pre-K, and that's another $26 billion. Then he wants to provide free college, or at least community college. He wants to limit that, as does Beto O'Rourke, but that's still $6 billion a year. Wants to double the number of psychologists and social workers in schools. That's another $14 billion. So, after a while, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, it adds up to real money. That's $78 billion right there for a total. That is pretty significant as well. But Kamala Harris, she outbids him entirely because she wants to make community college free, but she wants to add debt-free four-year college. That's another $80 billion. Increase government's investment in childcare. That's another $60 billion. Give the average public school teacher a $13,000 raise. That's another $31 billion. So she comes up with a number of $177 billion. And I can go through the rest of it, but it will just wear you out hearing all those numbers. I think the bottom line is simply this. The two leading candidates last night are talking about spending billions of dollars that we don't have, and it's just going to break the bank if indeed we get any of that passed, much less all of it passed. And then, of course, you can go to the previous night, which was Tuesday night, in which you had Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and they've run some numbers on that as well, and those are in the article. So if you find yourself saying, you know what, I would really like, if we could, for just a few minutes, to run some numbers and figure out how expensive all this free stuff is going to be, I think you will see what we've always said before. If somebody tells you it's free, it means you get to pay for it. So that's one of the articles. A piece by Karl Rove. We don't quote him very often, but it's entitled, Democrats' Big Ideas May Re-Elect Trump. And he says, from Medicare to for all to the Green New Deal, this is going to be hard, he says, to swing voters. And he uses some examples, but I'll just read two examples here before we get into all the details. But you have, first of all, the issue of Medicare for all. And that is obviously the brainchild of Senator Bernie Sanders. But you have four other presidential hopefuls. That would be Cory Booker, Kristen Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, and Elizabeth Warren that all also want to and have endorsed the issue of Medicare for all, which, as we pointed out yesterday, would actually make it unlawful for companies to provide employees health insurance or for private insurers to sell coverage that, quote, duplicates other benefits. So the first one, which is just a huge big ticket item, is, of course, Medicare for all. Let's add to that something we'll be talking about in about an hour with Dr. Merrill Matthews, and that is the issue of Green New Deal, which is co-sponsored by 6 presidential candidates. That would be Cory Booker, Kristen Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Amy Klobuchar. And that is so expensive, but again, it would basically attempt to stop the use of any oil and coal and gas in the next 10 years. Matter of fact, it probably would stop coal use almost immediately. And so that one, first of all, would be terribly expensive. It would require us to stop using fossil fuels, to retrofit every house and building, to end traditional agriculture, and to affect air travel, no doubt, and a variety of other issues that are part of that. And then one other one that surfaced last night a little bit and a little bit the night before was the issue of reparations, which, interestingly enough, at least 9 candidates, including all of the Green New Deal people I just mentioned, and then 6 other senatorial co-sponsors would also have the attempt to pay the descendants of slaves some kind of reparations. And so even if you think all of these are good ideas, and I don't, you just have to at least ask the obvious question, which isn't really being asked that much, and that is, how in the world do we pay for it? And the argument is, oh, well, we'll just tax, billionaires and companies. And of course, Amazon's taking it in the neck every night because they keep pointing out that it's the second largest company in the United States, and it paid no taxes last year. And there may be obviously reasons for that since it's losing money in many venues. But nevertheless, this is the argument that we'll just tax them and we'll just tax these big corporations, or we'll tax Wall Street. And I think any reasonable person says, wait a minute, if you tax Amazon, I'm buying stuff from Amazon, so I pay the taxes. And if you're taxing Wall Street, I have a 401k or I have an IRA on Wall Street, so I'm going to be paying that. If you talk about big corporations like Walmart and others, they're going to simply pass that on to us with higher prices. So you know what? I think I'm going to be paying for all of this, not to mention the fact that even if you were able to get all of that, it never stays just with the wealthy. It always makes its way to the middle class. And so as a result, you get to pay for all these free things that are being offered right now. Let's take a break, though. Jim Garrity has some things to talk about slogging our way through the Democrat primaries and the Democrat debates. So we'll get a perspective on that in just a minute. And if you'd like to read a few of these articles and see how they've run the numbers, then I think you certainly want to go to the website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover, and we will do so right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then we're going to get into some other conversation. David Geisler will be with us as we talk about the legacy of Norm Geisler, apologetics, and kind of what the future is, and even a documentary is going to come out, which I think would be one that you would want to watch about just the influence of his father, but also just the whole rise of apologetics. I think you're going to enjoy that. Dr. Merrill Matthews will be with us at about 1:30, and we'll spend some time talking about that. And let me just mention a couple of other articles we'll get into in the national program. The 2020 Democrats want you to pay for abortions. And this one I'll get into more detail a little bit later, but it has to do with some of the things that Kamala Harris would want to do. And it kind of brings us back to who is the likely nominee. From the very beginning, people like Colonel Allen West, and even myself have said that it's quite likely that Kamala Harris, Senator Kamala Harris, will be the Democratic nominee. If she is, she's going to have to overcome a lot of bumps along the way, one of which was posted just the other day that said she just is getting a reputation. There has not even been a primary. There hasn't even been a caucus yet. And if you get the reputation of being a flip-flopper, that oftentimes doesn't do you well. And here's a good example, because back in 2017, Kamala Harris said that she would be the first Democrat to announce she would co-sponsor Bernie Sanders' government takeover of health care, which is, of course, Medicare for all. She's still a co-sponsor, but now she has kind of changed, and in 2019 said she wanted to eliminate private insurance, even if you like your plan. By May of 2019, she was asked about her call to eliminate private insurance. There she flip-flopped and said, well, that's not really what I meant. In the first Democrat debate in June, Kamala Harris raised her hand when she was saying she was in favor of eliminating private insurance, only to claim the next day that she had misinterpreted the question. Then Kamala Harris added more confusion to her position by the middle of July when she said she supported the de facto elimination of private duplicative insurance, though not explicitly saying that she would legally mandate the outcome. Then earlier this week, she introduced her plan for a government takeover of health care, but at the same point in time, there were kind of some details that were sort of confusing for a lot of people, which brings me to the really interesting kind of summary, if you will, by Jim Garrity, who I quoted yesterday, slogging our way through the Democratic debates. And he said, American debate watchers learned that Kamala Harris can't really defend her record. Most candidates' debate playbooks are predictable. That Kirsten Gillibrand manages to pick the single least effective and least plausible line of attack against Joe Biden, and on and on. But let's go back to Kamala Harris. On paper, Kamala Harris is a strong contender, he says, for the 2020 Democrat nomination. But last night on the debate stage in Detroit, she demonstrated that as good as she is when she's on the attack, she looks brittle, flustered, and flailing when other candidates attack her. Kamala Harris's first move when attacked is to simply deny the accusation. 5 times last night, she began this sentence with, the reality is, and what follows from the rarely, where her comments is where she rarely refutes the accusation, but usually emphasizes a slightly different point. Dana Bash asked Harris about the Biden campaign's claim that her health care plan was have it every which way approach. The response from her was, the reality is that I've been spending time in this campaign listening to American families, listening to experts, listening to healthcare providers, listening to lots of people. Says Jim Garrity is nice, but that doesn't really address whether the plan is an attempt to have it every which way. Biden then said that her plan would cost $3 trillion. She responded, again, the reality is that our plan will bring health care to all Americans under a Medicare for all system. That doesn't address the cost issue, as Jim Garrity points out again. Biden went after her on the cost again, and Harris's best response was, well, the cost of doing nothing is far too expensive. Second, we're now paying $3 trillion a year for health care in America. Over the next 10 years, it's probably going to be $6 trillion. Harris was left arguing that we need to spend more in order to ensure that we don't spend more. So you can kind of see that after a while, it kind of gets into that issue. She is a prosecutor, and that was something where some people came at her for the first time as well. And I'll just pick this one up, and then we'll leave some of the rest for a little bit later. Because one of the things Jim Garrity says is, I don't know if marijuana prosecutions and death row evidentiary decisions will be enough to derail the Kamala Harris presidential campaign. But I do know that these sorts of examples are real complications to the image that she wants to project, which is that of a tough prosecutor who's on the side of the typical Democratic presidential primary debater and voter. Tulsi Gabbard, who seems to have a genuine animosity towards Harris, actually gave her a bad time by saying there are too many examples to cite. This is Tulsi Gabbard. But she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. That generated an applause from the crowd in the Fox Theater there in Detroit. She continued by saying, this again, Tulsi Gabbard, she blocked evidence. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep a bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way. I remember when I heard Representative Tulsi Gabbard say that, I said, she's going to have to, that is, Kamala Harris is going to have to work real hard to deal with that, and she never really answered the question. So even though there is still the assumption that the most likely person to go against Donald Trump a year from now is Kamala Harris, you did get a sense that it's going to be a long road from now to the eventual nomination. And the fact that, let me mention one other point, that Joe Biden did relatively well, went on the attack, defended himself pretty well, gives at least a possibility that because of his high name recognition and his connection to Barack Obama, still give us a chance to see that he might be the nominee. But he's going to have to, along the way, deal with some major issues, not the least of which was the issue of deportations. Since we're coming up on a break, let me just mention that I will get into that in more detail in the next hour or the hour after that, because when some used to refer to Barack Obama as the deporter-in-chief, that's sort of true, but it's not exactly true. And it is something that obviously Cory Booker and others tried to hang around his neck, and is certainly something that is going to dog Joe Biden for quite some time, because as Cory Booker said, when you want to actually connect with Barack Obama, you use that. But then when you don't want to use Barack Obama, you hide. You can't have it both ways, was his argument. And I'm sure he will not be the only person pointing that out over this long, detailed, and contentious primary season. But let's take a break. And first of all, let me encourage you to go to our website. You'll find a couple of articles, especially the high cost of free stuff, the cost of the Green New Deal, candidates want you to pay for abortion, and some great conversation we're going to have in the next 2 hours about everything from apologetics to the debates to even how biblical archaeology is confirming once again the historical accuracy of the Bible. So we've got a lot to cover, and I think you will find it all interesting. So take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. If it all comes a little too fast and furious, take the time not only to print out those articles, but you can obviously download the podcast or go to the YouTube channel, listen to it or watch it again, and pass it on to others who might benefit from some of the things we talk about every single day here on Point of View. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, David Geisler will be with us. He is the son of Dr. Norm Geisler. Just a great opportunity to hear from him, and all that comes up right after these messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to be covering a lot of different issues over the next 2 hours, so I hope you'll stay with us for the 2 hours of broadcast, because first of all, we're going to look at this area of apologetics, because we'll be talking with our friend Dr. David Geisler. As we've mentioned on this program before, Dr. Norm Geisler, his father, died, and of course there was a funeral, and just recently I was with Ravi Zacharias at Camp of the Woods, and he did, of course, the eulogy. So we're going to talk about kind of what the future is for this area of apologetics worldview. Of course, we had our second Democrat debate last night, so later this hour, Dr. Merrill Matthews will be with us, and if you'd like to read ahead, we have a couple of very good articles that I'll be referencing. One, the cost of free stuff. Yeah, there are a lot of claims that this is all going to be free, but what's the cost and who's going to have to pay for it? Even one specific one that was run more recently on what the Green New Deal would cost your typical household. One on how the Democrat candidates really want you to pay for abortions and much more. So we'll get into those issues of climate change, of health care reform, immigration, and some of the rest. And then before the end of the second hour, also want to talk a little bit more about this area of apologetics as it relates to archaeology. Ryan Dennison, Dr. Ryan Dennison, who is the son of Jim Dennison, interestingly enough, has his PhD in church history, this week has been writing the daily article while his father and mother are traveling. And his one today has to do with the ancient Church of the Apostles. And I thought, as we get into some of those issues, and as we've even talked about on this program, that last year, 2018, was just a banner year for archaeology. We have some new things coming down. So we're going to cover a little bit of the Democrat debate today, and we'll spend about an hour on that. But we're also going to focus on some other issues that I think would be of interest to you. And, of course, we'll give full coverage to all of the debates this week on our Friday weekend edition. But let me bring to the microphone Dr. David Geisler. He's been on the program with us before. He's a graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary, has 2 master's degrees there, and also his Doctor of Ministry in Apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. He is the president of Norm Geisler International Ministries and joins me now by phone. So, David, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
It's great to be with you, Kerby.
We all lament the loss of Dr. Geisler, and I think as this loss has begun to circulate through the Christian community, I've found out about all sorts of other individuals who were profoundly influenced by your father. And I suspect, first of all, a lot of people would like to know kind of how the funeral went, how the eulogies have went, and also how some of these comments that no doubt you've heard from Christian leaders all over the country and around the world have come. So give us a little bit of a summary of what's happened over the last couple of weeks.
Sure. I've been very thankful for all the cards and letters that we've gotten from people all over the world expressing their condolences. And it was really great to learn a lot of stories of ways that my father had impacted their lives in very personal ways. And some of the stories I had never heard before. And so it was just very encouraging just to hear all the ways that my father had impacted people's lives. And the service was wonderful. Ravi actually was on his way, I think, to Korea. And I caught him halfway in between, and he came back. And he didn't even think twice to My father wanted him to share in the service, and he honored that request and came back and did a great job. And it was just a wonderful testimony to my father and all the lives that he's touched over the years.
Let's talk about you and what you've been doing. Of course, you've been on the program with us before, and of course, you growing up in a home where one of the master apologists of this last century was there, but also you've had such a heart for evangelism, and I appreciate the fact that in many churches, various conferences, you've pulled together evangelism and apologetics in a very significant way, and I suspect that that's going to continue through the Norm Geisler International Ministries.
It is. I mean, let me tell you a story just to try to clarify this for your readers. When I was a little boy, I would go with my dad, and he would debate different people. And to be honest, Kerby, I always felt sorry for whoever had to debate him.
Oh, yeah.
But what I learned over the years is what works well in a debate situation doesn't always work so well in a one-on-one witnessing situation. And sometimes we talk to one another like we're in a debate. And the problem is, as you know, we win the battle, but we lose the war. And so that's been my passion. And we are going to continue to integrate, this passion of evangelism that I have into the apologetics my dad already did. In fact, I wanted to clarify for your readers, the trifecta that my father developed in the areas of philosophy, theology, and apologetics. We're going to take the next step and integrate that into our evangelism and discipleship models. So you can be praying for us. That's what we're going to be working on, taking everything he's done and, making it even more applicable for the average layperson in all around the country.
I might just mention we have a link to the website, as people might imagine. It's ngim.org, stands for Norm Geisler International Ministries. As people go there, they're going to find out something which you and I have talked about and even worked on a little bit, and that is a documentary, Not Qualified. As I understand, those of our listeners in North Carolina or anybody that goes to the National Conference on Christian Apologetics, which we so often try to promote, taking place this year, October 11th and 12th at Calvary Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, I believe there's going to be an opportunity for people to actually preview the film. Is that true?
Yes, we are going to preview the film. We're going to show the trailer, and they can get an idea of what it's all about. I'm really excited about this documentary because, as you know, my father was practically illiterate all through high school, and he didn't actually even start reading very well until he got to college. And here God took this illiterate little boy from Detroit and made him into a scholar. And basically the theme of the movie is, if God can do this in my father's life, think of what God can do in our lives if we yield our life to him and allow him to be used in significant ways. And so I'm excited about the theme of this movie. I think it would be an encouragement to every Christian that God can use all of us and make a difference in our circle of influence.
Let's take a break. When we come back, I thought we'd talk about a couple other issues. First of all, some of the opportunities that people that are listening right now, our churches listening, and pastors can maybe take advantage of some of the training that you've done, talking about the film. Also, of course, your father founded a number of seminaries, which you're very familiar with, so I want to talk about those as well. And so I just thought this would be an opportunity to give a little bit of a tribute to him, and then we're going to get into, of course, the debate last night, which was the second of two debates for the Democratic nomination. And so we'll get into that in some detail in about 15, 20 minutes, and that's all coming up, point of view. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about this Norm Geisler International Ministries, or I'd like to learn some more about evangelism and apologetics, go to our website or just go directly to ngim.org. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The debate and discussion about transgender issues will continue because of a transgender ideology that is developed that is actually harmful to kids. That is one of the conclusions of the book by Ryan Anderson with the creative title When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. The transgender ideology promotes the opportunity for children to change their gender with surgery and drugs, and parents are told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. Ryan Anderson counters that the best studies of gender dysphoria have found that between 80 and 95% of children who express a discordant gender identity will come to identify with their bodily sex if natural development is allowed to proceed. He goes on to document that even children going through transitioning treatment still have an extraordinarily high rate of suicide attempts compared to the general population. He reminds us that we should be tolerant and loving towards children and adults who struggle with their gender identity. But we should also be aware of the potential harm when transgender identity is normalized. Unfortunately, we are living in a world where transgender activists want more than tolerance and kindness. They demand affirmation. We aren't allowed to question whether using medical treatments to aid in transgender transformation is positive for children. In his new book, Ryan Anderson shows that the best biology, psychology, and philosophy support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality. As he puts it, biology isn't bigotry. I hope the American people will trust the best scientific evidence and not reject it in favor of the transgender ideology. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. David Geisler with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his father and, again, part of and president of the Norm Geisler International Ministries. I think all of us have stories about the first time we met Norm Geisler. I remember I had read about one of his books, by a book by Josh McDowell, and so I ordered it. It was A General Introduction to the Bible by Norm Geisler and William Nix. Then shortly thereafter, I was actually working with him because one of the first, matter of fact, the first book I ever edited for Probe Ministries was a book that Norm Geisler had put together. And actually, it wasn't completely put together, so I had a chance to put together some of the pieces, which later become The Roots of Evil. And then when he moved to the Dallas area, we worked together on lots of issues, did a number of debates together and those kinds of things. And we even mentioned Ravi Zacharias. I was just telling some people the other day, how did I meet Ravi Zacharias for the very first time? Well, Norm Geisler and I were together at the National Religious Broadcasters, and this rather young man comes up that was Ravi Zacharias and said, Dr. Geisler, I just want to thank you. I took classes from you at Trinity. I never said anything in the classroom, but, you have said such a profound influence, and I'm going to take these ideas of apologetics and worldview and use in my evangelism. So, David, they're just a short history of my own experience with your dad, and we've interacted over the years at the International Society for Christian Apologetics and at Southern Evangelical Seminary and so many other areas. And let's talk about that, because you have a degree from Southern Evangelical Seminary, and that's one of the seminaries that your dad actually founded.
It is, and it's been going now for, I think, 27 years, if I counted correctly. 27 years since he started that. And then a few years ago, he helped start another seminary, Veritas, Evangelical Seminary in California, which is now Veritas International University. And that's run by Joe Holden, who was a graduate of SES, and his expertise is in the area of archaeology. And they're developing a fine program in archaeology right now from everything that I've been told. And I continue to teach at Southern Evangelical Seminary. I'm an adjunct professor, and I've had the opportunity for the last 4 years at least to teach doctoral students how to more effectively use their apologetics and evangelism. And that's been my passion. You know, growing up, it was kind of hard for me not to learn apologetics, but I really saw that there was a need within the church to help people get a handle on actually how to use all these good things, these good tools that my father has developed, like the 12 points that show that Christianity is true. How do we use all these tools, apologetic tools, in a way that helps people take a step towards Christ in every conversation? And that's why my dad and I wrote this book, Conversational Evangelism, and his book, 12 Points That Show That Christianity Is True. That's a great 1-2 punch combination, I think, for any church to use. And I'm going to continue to focus on those things in the years ahead, just helping people to see the value of what my father has done, and then encourage them to integrate that into their discipleship and evangelism programs.
You know, you mentioned Joseph Holden, and anybody that receives the archaeology booklet that I wrote just a while back, the first resource listed there is by Joseph Holden and Norm Geisler, the popular handbook of archaeology in the Bible, discoveries that confirm the reliability of Scripture. It is one that came out through Harvest House, and so we'll be talking about archaeology a little bit later today, but it's just a good illustration of just the incredible legacy that your father left. But before we run out of time, let's see if we can talk about that for just a minute, because you want to carry this on. And you talked about, of course, Conversational Evangelism, which is a really good book and one that I would recommend, and some of the other resources. But what would be available to our listeners if they go to the website, and we have a link there? They can go to your online store. And one of the things I've appreciated about you and your father is you have the books, but you also have these PowerPoint presentations if somebody wants to present them. You have DVDs and a variety of other things that are there. So first of all, talk about the resources, but then as you do that, talk about the opportunity maybe for someone to schedule you to come and do a whole teaching series at a church or a conference on the subject of evangelism and apologetics. So what is available to some of our listeners out there?
Well, first of all, the email is info@ngim.org. If they are interested in getting more information, just email us and we'll send them some more. Right now, we're actually in the process of putting together bookmarks. I haven't told you this. The bookmarks are, first of all, our conversational evangelism methodology. On the one side, it says LISTEN, that's the acronym, and the other side, it says 5 planks, and that's what we teach when we try to teach conversational evangelism. But the new bookmark is the 12 points that show that Christianity is true, and I've actually had my kids learn those 12 points by memory, and I'd encourage every parent to just get the bookmark and teach their kids those 12 points, and we'll make that available and make it easier for people to see. Just go to our website, and I'll make sure that that's available within the next week.
Some of the other things I might mention, you have these courses. One, of course, your course on conversational evangelism. And I might mention you also have that one in Chinese, which I think is kind of fun for people that have that background, but also Fast Track Seminary and some others. So there are some courses. I know there are a fair number of listeners that say, you know, I'd love to go to seminary. That's just not going to happen. But the good news is, because of things like Veritas and Southern Evangelical Seminary and others now doing this as well, you can actually get a seminary education, and you don't have to get on a plane to hear every one of the lectures. You can actually participate in that way, can't you?
Exactly. And that's what we want to encourage people to do, is get as much information as they can and use that in their circle of influence, so that they can more effectively reach this increasingly lost world that we live in.
I think we might have lost you there, but again, that's the opportunity to mention as much. Okay, there we go. Got you again. But I just thought I'd just once again mention that again, this documentary is coming out for people that go to National Conference on Christian Apologetics. That's one of the conferences that takes place every year through Southern Evangelical Seminary. It's kind of a who's who of some of the best and the brightest in the area of worldview and apologetics. That'll be October 11th and 12th. That's where you're going to have at least a preview, some of the trailer of that. And as we get a little closer to the release of that film, I certainly want to get you back on, David, so that we can promote that as well. And certainly our condolences go out to you and your family. I've known you, but I've known your father and mother even longer. And I know it's been a difficult time, but I just thought it would be good to feature him today. Might just mention as a program note, Monday we're going to be talking about Francis Schaeffer. You know, I've oftentimes said we have a generation that knows not Schaeffer. Well, we're going to try to solve some of that next Monday, because these are people that have really helped us know how to understand the world that we live in, to understand how to defend that biblical worldview, and how to be very discerning about the false worldviews and the false philosophies that are out there. So that is one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on the program today, and I appreciate your willingness to do so recently after your father's death. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
You're welcome, Kerby. Great to be with you.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, we will get into the Democrat debate last night. It was the second one, and we learned a little bit more about the personalities involved, especially Kamala Harris, as well as, of course, Joe Biden and a couple of others. And so we're going to get into that in some detail, but we also want to get into the content, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring Dr. Merrill Matthews on the program. He is, without a doubt, as a resident scholar of the Institute for Policy Innovation, one of the, I think, leading experts on the area of health care policies and insurance and those kinds of things. It's something he's worked on for many years and testified before Congress. More recently, he's also developed kind of an expertise not only in the health care area, but in energy. And since two of the big topics last night were health care delivery and health care insurance, and Medicare for all and all that, but the other one was climate change and the Green New Deal. We'll focus on that with him. And then after he leaves, I want to get into a third area. That's the immigration issue, which was also big last night. So we'll have a chance to look at all of those issues. And if you'd like to join our conversation and provide some perspective or ask some questions, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. And if we don't cover all of it today, we plan to cover even more of it tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition. But let's, if we can, pull up a chair here, see what we can learn, and begin to evaluate in terms of the Democrat debates that took place Tuesday night and Wednesday night, but especially we'll focus some of our time and attention on the one last night, where 10 different individuals on the stage there in Detroit tried to make the case for why they need to be the nominee on the Democratic Party to go up against Donald Trump. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Last night was the second of two Democrat debates that took place this week. Of course, there are more to come. At the moment, it looks like only 8 will qualify for the next debate because they've raised the, if you will, the bar a little bit. But there may be some others that will qualify. But you have 25 candidates. 5 did not make it. 10 Tuesday night, 10 Wednesday night. And, of course, we wanted to look at some of the things that were said, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring onto the microphone Dr. Merrill Matthews, resident scholar with the Institute for Policy Innovation, and focus on a couple of areas of his expertise. One of those, of course, is the issue of health care. So, Dr. Merrill Matthews, always great to have you on the program.
Well, Kerby, thank you for having me.
Let's, if we can, get into this whole idea of Medicare for all. And we learned from Kamala Harris that she's all over the map. I mean, she was a co-sponsor of Medicare for All, and then she at one point said she wanted to eliminate private insurance. Later on, said maybe she wanted to skip on some of the details. There was a back and forth, Joe Biden saying, you want to have it both ways. But the bottom line is that over the last couple of nights, we've seen a number of people that are the co-sponsors, not just Bernie Sanders, but also Cory Booker and Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, and Elizabeth Warren. The idea is that it would be a government takeover, but for people that don't know, they might just say, well, I like Medicare, so Medicare for all, why not? Can you give us some perspective there?
Well, first off, Medicare for all, as Senator Sanders proposes it, is not Medicare. There is no Medicare as we know it today would be eliminated. The term Medicare for all for him has largely been a marketing tool because there will not be, if you're a senior and you like your Medicare, you will not be able to keep it under his plan. It is a strict universal coverage single payer health care plan where we pay higher taxes and the government pays for what's all considered all medically necessary doctors, hospitals, prescription drugs, even dental coverage and long-term care and nursing home. The government would pay for all of that. And so you wouldn't, if you're a doctor, you wouldn't necessarily be a government employee, as is true in the national health insurance and a national health system in Great Britain, but you would, essentially all your money would come from the government. So you would be you'd be a close to a government employee. So anyway, that's what they want to do, and they've been debating that. Sanders has several people who agree with him with that. But the interesting thing about this debate in both Tuesday night and Wednesday night was the divide in which several are stepping up and saying, no, I want to try to keep private health insurance. Why in the world are we taking away the health insurance of roughly 160 million Americans, that's about half the country, and their workers and their dependents who get their health insurance through their employer? And you saw a pretty strong pushback from Senator Bennett from Colorado on that.
Yes.
And he does not want to go that far. Joe Biden does not want to go that far. They all sort of agree that they'd like to get to a single-payer health care system at some point, but they feel like it really doesn't work well to take people's health insurance away when they have it. And we've got to be fair. Some people don't like their health insurance, but millions of Americans are very satisfied with their health insurance policy.
Well, let's get into that because that was something that came from Tuesday night, but I want to get your perspective. Bernie Sanders at one point said, I wrote the blank bill. Okay, well.
He did indeed.
But read the bill, because I've got in front of me here Section 107, Prohibition Against Duplicative Coverage, and it said it would be unlawful for a private health insurer to sell health insurance coverage that duplicates the benefits provided under the Act. It would be unlawful for an employer to provide benefits for an employee, former employee, or dependents of an employee or former employee that duplicates the benefits provided under the Act. That seems to me that would get rid of all those millions of people that have private health insurance that they would like to keep.
That's right. If you have something that's considered medically necessary under the law, you would have to get it through the government system. You could not go out to a doctor in the U.S. and pay that doctor out of pocket, or you could not use health insurance to cover that. That would be prohibited, and there are 3 countries in the world that do that: Canada, Cuba, and North Korea.
That's not a group you want to be in necessarily.
Even in England, about 10% of the population are able to, if they wanted to opt out, about 10% of the population opt out. They pay private health insurance. So in England, it's sort of like our public school system where we all pay for the public school system, but some people opt out for private schools instead because they would prefer to do that. So you can do that in England in healthcare, but under Bernie's law, you cannot do that. And quite frankly, you can't do that under the current Medicare system now, at least not easily. If you're on Medicare as a senior today and you want to go to a doctor, let's say you want to go to a psychiatrist, and you don't want that on your medical record, you don't want that as part of it. You say, Mr. Doctor Psychiatrist, I'd like to come and just pay for it out of pocket. You can't do that. No. If you want to go to a doctor who charges more and says, I can't take Medicare because it doesn't pay me enough, you can't pay the difference. That's called balance billing. That's against the law. So there's a sense in which we already have a Medicare system that does that. But since most doctors and hospitals take Medicare, it's not a problem because you don't. Very few of the doctors actually opt out of the system. So it hasn't been the problem it would be, but under Sanders' plan and those who back him, you simply could not do that in our system.
And again, I might just mention we have a couple of articles that we will get to a little bit later. The cost of free stuff. Boy, if you think medical costs are high now, just imagine when it becomes, quote, free. And also have one, which we'll talk about a little bit later with Dr. Merrill Matthews, on what the Green New Deal could cost a typical household. But last night, to his credit, Joe Biden came to Kamala Harris and say, wait a minute, your plan is going to cost $3 trillion. And her argument is, well, we're better off paying $3 trillion a year for health care now because later it might be $6 trillion, which didn't give me any comfort. What about these costs? Can you get some estimate or give us some estimate on those?
If you go to a single-payer system, if you go to Bernie Sanders, it's roughly, the cost is estimated roughly $3 trillion a year over 10 years, or about $33 trillion is where they put it, 33 trillion. And Sanders initially sort of pushed back on that, but he generally sort of accepts that it's going to cost something like that much money. So it's a lot of money. Kamala Harris, on hers, it's not, I don't think she has had that scored by the Congressional Budget Office yet that I'm aware of, but she's actually trying to straddle the fence because what she's allowing people to do is to buy into Medicare, but it's a Medicare Advantage plan. Now, about 20 million seniors right now buy the private sector health insurance that's called Medicare Advantage. They're seniors, they're on Medicare, but they buy these plans, and it's basically an HMO run by a private sector insurance company. And about 35% of the seniors like that, and they want to do that. And so Kamala is trying to move in that direction, saying you could buy into the Medicare Advantage plan. If you're born here and you're uninsured, you'd be automatically put in that plan. If you work for an employer and you want to do that, you could do that. If you're an employer and you want to just transfer all your people over to the Medicare Advantage Kamala plan, you could do that. So she's trying to provide a real option out there in the sense of allowing people a lot of choice, and Bernie's just not about choice. Both Joe Biden and Kamala are trying to give people choice. Bernie Sanders doesn't want to do that.
One other point before we take a break, and that is we keep hearing from Bernie Sanders and others about all the uninsured. I thought the Affordable Care Act was supposed to solve that. If their problems are with the system, this is a system we've implemented and has been around for quite some time, hasn't it?
See, that's the key thing there, is that the system they're complaining about so much right now is the Affordable Care Act. And it was initially going to be universal care once, in other words, everybody had it. Once they sort of backed off on that, but they said essentially everybody who wants health insurance can get it. But right now, it did reduce the number of uninsured, but those were all people who went from in states that expanded Medicaid. The people who went out and bought their own policy in in the individual market has stayed roughly the same. Those people are different. My wife was in that individual market where she bought her own insurance. She's no longer in that. She's in the Christian sharing ministry. But you actually, and the employers providing health insurance have been roughly the same. So they messed up the system significantly, but they did reduce the number of uninsured by expanding Medicaid.
Well, let's take a break. And you mentioned something in passing. I want our Christians to understand that if you're with like a MediShare or Samaritan's Ministry or some of those might be considered insurance, and those would also probably under Section 107 under Medicare for All be eliminated as well. But let's take a break. And we'll also take some phone calls. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Probably take more calls in the next hour when we have kind of an open line. But when we come back, I wanted to talk with Dr. Merrill Matthews, who is not only an expert on the healthcare issue, but also on energy. A lot of comments last night about climate change, Green New Deal. One of the articles we've posted here, what the Green New Deal could cost a typical household. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join a conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to some of those calls a little bit later, but if you'd like to call in, we'd love to hear from you. The program's called Point of View. I'd love to hear your point of view. And one of the things that I also wanted to talk about with Dr. Merrill Matthews is not only health care, that's certainly on the table, but one of the other big issues is the issue of climate change. Now, Dr. Merrill Matthews, when we look at some of the candidates, almost all of them on the stage at one time or another thought climate change was a big issue. Governor Jay Inslee has made that the foundation of his campaign. And I think Andrew Yang says, it's just too late, so you might as well move to higher ground. So we've got, sorry, I just tried to do that with a straight face, but that's just too tough to do. But that's the issue. This is the existential threat. And so the answer to that is, at least according to these individuals, is that we need the Green New Deal. And this is something that is sponsored by, 6 presidential candidates, Senator Cory Booker and Senator Gillibrand, as well as Harris, Saunders, Warren, and, of course, Amy Klobuchar. So this is a big issue for those who are in Congress, and it's a big issue for almost everyone that's been on the stage the last 2 nights. But what about this? I mean, are we at the end of the future of the United States, the end of the future of the planet Earth because of climate change? What's going on?
Well, you have to just. I listened to some of them talk about how we've got 10 years left. I think Beto O'Rourke did that on the first night.
Yeah.
10 years left to fix this, and if we don't do it, we're all dead. And you hear Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying essentially the same thing. The Earth's been warming on a gradual warming trend since the last ice age. That's why we're not in an ice age. So that is the case. The issue is whether or not humans are exacerbating that warming. Maybe they are putting a lot of carbon in the air, but the fact is that the U.S. has done actually one of the best jobs of trying to reduce that carbon dioxide that it's been releasing, if you think that's actually a problem out there. But the issue about the Green New Deal is it is much, much more than an effort to try to get us to renewable energy.
Yes.
It covers everything. It wants to retrofit every building in the country. It has social justice issues. It has racial issues. It has pay inequality issues in there. It has all these things that have nothing to do with the issue of whether or not if you feel like we're stewards of the earth and we should be doing the best we can to try to maintain a clean earth, fine. That's a good case to make. The Green New Deal is a comprehensive utopian socialist vision to try to implement everything under the guise of trying to be environmentally friendly.
Might just mention that our first article there, The Cost of Free Stuff, kind of gives you an overview, but the second one comes from friends at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And I know, Dr. Merrill Matthews, you may come up with slightly different numbers, but the attempt that they did in this particular piece was to say, what if indeed you did implement the Green New Deal? Let's hope it never happens. What would it cost a typical household? And for our people that we're broadcasting to, the average cost was around $70,000 extra a year in terms of household cost. For our friends per year. For our friends in Alaska, I hate to tell you, theirs was more along the order of $100,000 extra a year. And so they go through all of the costs of year 2 to 5 and 6 and all the rest. So I don't think people have any idea of what it would indeed entail, even if we could stop producing coal, and if we could completely get and wean ourselves off of oil and gas within 10 years, and it's not going to happen. But even if it was, the incredible cost would be immense, wouldn't it?
Just to be clear, the Green New Deal in the first year, according to the Competitive Enterprise Institute study, would cost more than the average family makes.
Yes. Better way to put it.
That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money.
It's just mind-boggling, and that's if you think you could actually achieve that, because what you have to do, and I did a calculation and published it in The Hill back in February, I believe it was, where I said, all right, if you just wanted to replace the fossil fuel power generation, that's electricity generation in the country, fossil fuels, where you're talking about coal, natural gas, or oil, produce about, if I remember right, about 66% of all, 67%, something like that, of the electricity generation in the country.
Right.
If you wanted to replace that with wind turbines, you would have to put in roughly another 600,000 wind turbines, and on top of the 6,000 or 7,000 that we have right now, you'd cover the country with that, and those are still intermittent. The problem with the turbines and the solar power is they are intermittent. They don't. The sun doesn't shine all day. The wind doesn't blow all the time. So you have to try to create big batteries to store this any extra that you have early, so that you can run it when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. And they just haven't got that down well yet.
Yes. Let's take a phone call or two as we go along here. We have Dr. Merrill Matthews. By the way, if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to read some more of that, we also have a link to ipi.org. But Vaughn in Illinois, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, you guys hit on it just a while ago about wind turbines and the solar power. And, Biden was talking there on the caucus there is what I call it. But anyway, about doing away with fossil fuels. I mean, where's this dude get his brain out of the wind? I mean, the deal is we only tapped in about 1% of the solar that we used and the wind over the last few years.
Well, let's get Dr. Merrill Matthews to help us out with that, because we're coming up to a break in just a few minutes. And that is, solar and wind together, maybe even hydroelectric, those are still very small percentages of the way in which we get energy in the country. True?
Vaughn's absolutely right. Yeah, the wind power represents about 6% or so of our electricity generation. Solar's about 1% or a little more, and that's after 8 years of the Obama administration pouring money into these things. So they're a very small percentage. I do have other renewables. You have water, hydropower, and some things like that, and you have nuclear. But the liberals don't want nuclear. So how you're going to get to replacing the fossil fuels, you just can't do it. We may eventually be able to do it at some point, but it's a long ways away.
I would think so. Just since we're coming to a break and I want to let you go, I wanted to mention that people might say, okay, I've got to read a little bit more. And, of course, you are publishing in everything from the Wall Street Journal to The Hill to Barron's and all sorts of other places, Forbes. So if people want to find a place where they can find your articles, I think the best way to go is to ipi.org, which is the Institute for Policy Innovation. And then you can find the articles by Dr. Merrill Matthews. You can read those. You can see some of the things that he's published on everything from healthcare to energy policy and a variety of other topics. And so, of course, I always love having you around the round table, and I appreciate you giving me a few minutes today to get some perspective on these debates that have taken place over the last couple of days, and we look forward to the next opportunity.
Thank you so much for having me.
We will do this again. And, of course, I also want to thank Dr. Merrill Matthews for sitting in this chair when I was out. And I'm going to be here for a while. But, again, I'm going to go visit a few of you, including, I mentioned Alaska. I'm going to be up in Alaska. And I was talking yesterday with somebody. I'm going to be in California. Those are not for a couple of weeks, but always like to meet some of the donors, like to visit some of the stations. So I just thought I'd give you that advance warning or at least mention. And when we come back from the break, let's take some more phone calls. If you would like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. So we'll have an open line. I do want to address a few more issues. Karl Rove says that these big ideas by the Democrats might reelect Donald Trump. There's kind of back and forth and flip-flopping in the Democrats. So we got a lot more to talk about, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Third hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to some of those phone calls in just a minute. Last night, though, as we point out, was a time in which we probably saw, it's always a debate that we can have time and time again, but probably saw the individual that will challenge Donald Trump. And that could either be the sort of establishment, and I put that in quotes, candidate, Joe Biden, or else the other person that many people believe has the greatest chance of challenging Donald Trump, and that would be Senator Kamala Harris from California. Now, there are all sorts of other reasons not to think that, because it is still very early. And in just a minute, I'll give you some reasons why not to think that, because of some of the things that were said even last night that may be exposed, that maybe this trip down the primary road for either Joe Biden or Kamala Harris is going to be difficult. But nevertheless, assuming that one of them indeed is the nominee, I would point you to the first article that we've posted on our website. It is a piece that was actually put together by Suzanne Hamner, which also, interestingly enough, although it's in Sons of Liberty Media, has a fairly significant quote, a series of quotes from WorldNet Daily. And I'll just use the two of those individuals, but you can find out as you look at this, you know, what all sorts of different candidates would actually cost you. But let's just take the two that I just mentioned to give you a little bit of an idea. Joe Biden wants to triple the amount of money spent on Title I schools, $32 billion. Wants to create universal pre-K, that's another $26 billion. Wants to provide free community college, that's $6 billion a year. Wants to double the number of psychologists and social workers in schools, that's another $14 billion. So that's a total of $78 billion total. And that, of course, does not include some of the things we just talked about, which is Green New Deal, Medicare for All, and all the rest. But you can see the sticker shock on this is immense. I mean, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon it adds up to real money. But he pales in comparison to the kinds of things that indeed Kamala Harris wants, because she too wants to make community college free. But she also adds to that making debt-free a 4-year public college, which is another $8 billion. Increase government's investment in child care, that's another $60 billion. Give the average public school teacher a $13,000 raise, that's another $31 billion. And again, these do not even include some of the high-tick items we just talked about, but that's $177 billion. At this point, we're just talking about so much money. And you have to ask the fundamental question, where does it come from? Well, the answer that comes from our people that were there on the stage Tuesday night, in particular, the two principals there, and that would be Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, is, well, we will tax the various corporations. And both Tuesday night and Wednesday night, Amazon got it in the neck because they kept saying, look at this, second largest company in the United States, employs the second highest number of people in the United States, and they paid no taxes. Well, there's some reasons for that, but we won't go into all that. But okay, you say we're going to figure out ways to tax them, not have a tax code that allows them to write off losses and expenses and things like that. the average person, if they're thinking, and I know most voters don't spend a lot of time thinking about the implications it might have for them, but the average person who orders from Amazon is going to say, now, wait a minute. If they're going to tax Amazon, Amazon's not going to pay for it. They're going to charge me more. I'm going to end up paying the taxes. So really, they're talking about charging me. Oh, and they're talking about charging Wall Street. But don't I think I have a 401k in the stock market, or a IRA, or even my company has that. And so they're going to have to give me much less in terms of retirement benefits. And they're going to go after the various corporations. And my goodness, I work for one of those corporations, and I kind of like to still have a job. And, you start figuring out very quickly that even though they say they're only going to go after billionaires and only going to go after the corporations and only going to go after Wall Street, they're going to come after me as well. And so that's kind of one of the big issues that I think is going to maybe surface later on. But a very good piece that came out by Jim Garrity, I quoted from him yesterday, pointed out that we maybe learned a little bit more about whether or not the road to the nomination for Senator Harris is going to be bump-free, because, as he said, on paper, Kamala Harris is a really strong contender for the 2020 Democratic nomination. But last night on the debate stage in Detroit, she demonstrated that as good as she is when she's on the attack, she looks brittle, flustered, and failing when other candidates attack her. Of course, her first move when attacked is to simply deny the accusation. He said 5 times. She began the sentence with, "The reality is," and of course you can see what that is. Dana Bash, for example, asked Harris about the Biden's campaign claim that her health care plan was a have it every which way approach. And Harris's response is, well, the reality is that I've been spending time in this campaign listening to American families, listening to experts, listening to health care providers. And Jim Garrity says, listening to lots of people is nice, but that doesn't really answer or address whether the plan is an attempt to have it each way. Joe Biden went after her and said, well, the plan would cost $3 trillion. She responded, are you ready for this? The reality is that our plan will bring health care to all Americans under a Medicare for all system. Okay, well, the question was about the cost. And so he came at her a second time about the cost. And the only answer she finally came up with, which I mentioned earlier, is, well, we're now paying $3 trillion a year for health care. Over the next years, we'll probably be spending $6 trillion. So might as well spend more now in order to ensure we don't spend more later. And so you got some of those kinds of things. By the way, it wasn't just over health care. You might have noticed that some of the things that were brought against her in terms of being a prosecutor were significant. And that's where I think at one point it was kind of interesting to recognize that Representative Tulsi Gabbard, who Jim Garrity says seems to have a genuine animosity towards Harris, began to say, you know, there are too many examples of her as a prosecutor to cite, but she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations, then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. Then Tulsi Gabbard continued. She blocked evidence. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences and to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep a bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way. And so, again, she makes some comments about working in the criminal justice system. But I think it illustrates as well that when you're on the attack against Joe Biden, then probably you look pretty strong. When you are being attacked, sometimes that tells you a great deal about your response. And there are some that I think might actually hold it against her because she was such an aggressive prosecutor in California, even though the argument is, I'm going to prosecute this man, Donald Trump, and you need to get behind me. But we learned a little bit more about that. And it was just a great illustration as well about the fact that it's a long road between now and the Democrat convention a year from now. But when we come back from the break, I want to also take on one of the other articles we posted. That is, the Democrats want you to pay for abortions. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The debate and discussion about transgender issues will continue because of a transgender ideology that is developed that is actually harmful to kids. That is one of the conclusions of the book by Ryan Anderson with the creative title When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. The transgender ideology promotes the opportunity for children to change their gender with surgery and drugs, and parents are told that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones may be the only way to prevent their children from committing suicide. Ryan Anderson counters that the best studies of gender dysphoria have found that between 80 and 95% of children who express a discordant gender identity will come to identify with their bodily sex if natural development is allowed to proceed. He goes on to document that even children going through transitioning treatment still have an extraordinarily high rate of suicide attempts compared to the general population. He reminds us that we should be tolerant and loving towards children and adults who struggle with their gender identity. But we should also be aware of the potential harm when transgender identity is normalized. Unfortunately, we are living in a world where transgender activists want more than tolerance and kindness. They demand affirmation. We aren't allowed to question whether using medical treatments to aid in transgender transformation is positive for children. In his new book, Ryan Anderson shows that the best biology, psychology, and philosophy support an understanding of sex as a bodily reality. As he puts it, biology isn't bigotry. I hope the American people will trust the best scientific evidence and not reject it in favor of the transgender ideology. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
A couple other issues I want to put on the table. One is immigration. The other is abortion, because those came up. And one of the things that Dr. Merrill Matthews has written about is that Democrats might actually resolve the question of whether illegal immigrants are a benefit or a burden to society. Now, he's kind of sticking his tongue in his cheek a little bit, so don't take it too seriously, but this is something he wrote about a month ago, because there's been this long-running debate as to whether or not immigrants who come here, illegal immigrants, illegal aliens, whatever phrase you want to use, undocumented workers, on and on, you can use whatever phrase you want to use, whether when they come in here, they're a net asset or a net cost to taxpayers in the economy. Candidly, this is one of those very few areas where Nick Pitts and I have a little bit of a disagreement, because, first of all, my favorite line is if we don't know how many immigrants we have here, any estimate you have is going to be flawed at the beginning. And since we have a census that's not going to let us ask who are citizens and who are not, that question is always going to be flawed at its core. But Dr. Merrill Matthews points out there's two different perspectives. Let's take the restrictive perspective. The Center for Immigration Studies, we've had some of those people on the program before, supports a kind of more restrictive immigration. They want to obviously build a wall. They want to limit the number of immigrants that come in here. And through a variety of different estimates, conclude that the average net fiscal cost of an illegal immigrant is about $65,000 during their lifetime. By contrast, you have a variety of others. I'll just use the one that he mentions here. This is an NPR, National Public Radio opinion piece that was written by their digital editor and had a number of so-called myths about immigrants. And the first myth is that immigrants cost the economy. that actually the argument here is that they benefit the economy because they conclude, looking at a report from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, found that immigration had an overall positive impact on the long run on economic growth. And again, you have to sort of ferret out some of this because they thought maybe it actually costs about $1,600 a person, but by the time you have the second generation, that contributes about $1,700 a year. So there's a long-term benefit, is at least the argument being made right now. And so as a result, he goes into talking about the issue of health care and how that would be affected. But I love his closing line. Regardless of whether the first generation of immigrants is a small net plus or minus for the economy, if Democrats turn immigration into a welfare grab bag, it will be a net loss for all of us. And the point he's making is if we don't keep closing our border and we do open up health care for anybody that crosses into the border, we recognize all the hands went up for the Democrats, we might actually be able to figure it out. And if indeed you are providing health care for anybody that crosses the border, we all know that that would be a net piece. And it brings us to something else that I thought I might mention because I just learned this recently. We on this program have talked about a few times in which the criticism of the Trump administration is that he's been deporting individuals at a record level. Last night in the debate, and again, let's give credit to CNN, I must say that some of those questions were pretty good. One of those was turned to Vice President Joe Biden. And that is this time to, in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, I think the number they used was 800,000, was it something like that? Individuals had been deported. And of course, this brings us to the fact that some of the various open borders kind of Latino groups have sometimes referred to in the past Barack Obama as the deporter in chief. And so the argument that has been made by some of the supporters of Barack Obama and President Obama and his administration, and the argument that I thought we were going to hear last night from the vice president is, well, those really weren't deportations. Here's the rest of the story. And I didn't learn this until recently. When we had people crossing the borders back in the early years of the Obama administration, and some of that tended to dry up because of the 2008 recession, but because we did have some concerns about that, especially some of the union officials were upset that there would be people coming across the border in record numbers, and this would affect the jobs of their union workers. So one of the things that President Obama did was kind of fiddle with the numbers. That is this. I think if I were to ask you, what is a deportation is when somebody has come into this country, been in this country, captured by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and then sent back across the border. Wouldn't you define that as deportation? I think most of us would. That's not how the Obama administration defined it. If they met somebody at the border and prevented them from coming into the country and sent them back to their home country, in most cases it was Mexico, that was considered a deportation. So the number was artificially high in that these weren't really deportations where you go into a community, round up individuals that are here illegally and send them by bus or plane or whatever across the border. Do you get that? Now, there's where the problem began, because then as that number got out, then some of the Latino groups, especially some of the more open border type of groups, got upset that he was getting to be known as the deporter in chief. So that's when you had some people in the administration kind of wink and say, well, they really weren't deporting. We were just simply catching them at the border. So if you did not know that, I did not know that until recently. I thought I'd pass it on to you just to see how that gets played out in the next debate, because I do believe that this is something that's going to dog Joe Biden, because if you want to win over some of the Democrat primary voters, you don't want them to think that one of the key issues that you want to use against Donald Trump, that he's mean-spirited, that he built all those cages. No, he didn't. That he is implementing something that has never been done before, that he's deporting more people than ever before. you're not going to want to have somebody running against somebody where that issue is pretty much moot. And so we'll see how that plays itself out, but I just thought I'd pass that on real quickly. We're going to get into this issue of archaeology in a minute, but let me finish off on the issue of abortion, because our third article for you to read, it's by Alexandria De Sanctis, and it's entitled 2020 Democrats Want You to Pay for Abortions. And even though over the last two nights, Tuesday night and Wednesday night, you've heard a lot of back and forth. There have been a number of people that either have been for Medicare for all or against it. You've had even Kamala Harris say, mine is Medicare for all. And Bernie Sanders, if he was in the same stage that night, would say, no, yours is not. And so there are people that are saying we want to have a private option. Others saying we don't want to have a private option. And so there's a fair amount of disagreement about health care. But there's unanimity on this. As she points out, Alexandra De Sanctis says, whatever health care program the federal government offers, it will cover abortion. The unstated premise, she says, underlying this demand is flawed. Whether or not you believe a woman has a right to an abortion isn't health care. It's a scientific fact that every abortion procedure ends the life of a distinct human being. Health care heals, it doesn't kill. Pregnancy isn't a disease. It's a proper functioning of a natural capacity of a female body. So then how do we deal with that? Even as the Democrat candidates, she says, try to distinguish themselves on health care, all of them have made it very clear that they support a national health care program that would finance every woman's abortion at any stage of pregnancy and for any reason. Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All would take this step further. Not only would he nullify the Hyde Amendment, which currently prevents Medicaid dollars from directly reimbursing abortion procedures, but also providing comprehensive reproductive care, which, of course, is a euphemism for abortion. You can see that that is certainly in the various statements that have come from Harris and Booker and Warren and Gillibrand and all sorts of other individuals. And as we're coming to a break, even Joe Biden, his plan, it says, would add a public option to Obamacare that would cover contraception and a woman's constitutional right to choose. That's a direct quote from it. Again, another euphemism for directly funding abortion procedures along with birth control, including, of course, emergency contraception, IUDs, and all sorts of other things as well. So if the Democrats disagree on their health care plan, it is clear that every single one of them agree on one thing. You will have to pay for abortion for any reason at any time. And so I just wanted to post that article for you to read and maybe to pass on to some of your sphere of influence in case anybody has any doubts about what they would indeed want to do if indeed they occupy the Oval Office. Let's take a break. When we come back, I'm going to change topics again. This ancient church of the apostles. Fascinating article. It's in the daily article, and we'll talk more about that with Dr. Ryan Dennison right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate two replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, I thought we would change the focus once again. Of course, we've been talking about politics all this week, but even earlier this last hour, we talked about apologetics, and one of the things we talk about so often is apologetics, worldview, church history, and to put some of that in perspective, I even published a little booklet, which we have right here, on archaeology, and the reason for that is, first of all, there have been some great archaeological finds over the centuries, but even just this last year has been just a banner year. Christianity Today provided a very good article that kind of summarized some of the most significant archaeological discoveries in 2018. So that's something we cover from time to time and want to do that again. But I thought it was just very intriguing as I opened up my daily article, which is usually written by our good friend Jim Dennison. This week, it's actually being written by his son, Ryan Dennison, who has an MDiv degree from Truett Seminary, currently completing his PhD in church history from Carroll Theological Institute. And he's been writing this week, but the one today, and we have a link to it so that you can read it yourself and even subscribe to the daily article, which I say is just kind of must reading, is on this ancient church of the apostles that may have been discovered. And so we want to talk about what that is, what it means, and some of its significance. So, Ryan Dennison, it is great to have you on the program.
Thank you for the chance to join you. I appreciate it.
I certainly appreciate your father. We have always enjoyed having him here. I think he's going to be on for a short time next week. Never seen anybody who can communicate more information in a shorter amount of time than him. He just does a very good job. And you've been the recipient of it for many years, I know. But tell us about this, because if for people that have traveled with us to Israel or gone on other trips to Israel, we always take them to Capernaum, and they can see a synagogue, which was built on the original synagogue where Jesus was, and we can see what many people think was the home of Peter that eventually may have turned into a church. Well, now let's move to another part of that area on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And if we go to Bethsaida, these archaeologists tend to believe that they may have found the church of the apostles. Tell us more, if you might.
Yes, sir. Well, the discovery was first made back in around 2017, but they've been working in season since to further excavate it, and recent discoveries have given them the confidence to say with some authority that they believe they found the church that was first discussed by a guy named Bishop Willibald, who toured through the Holy Land back in the 700s, and talks about coming across the church of what's come to be known as the Church of the Apostles, that was built on what's thought to be the childhood home of Peter and Andrew. And so that's been something that's been debated since, because they've never been able to actually find a church in that region until recently. And one of the reasons they feel more confident in saying that this current church is that Church of the Apostles is they found mosaic tiles that they say were only found and only used in churches at the time, along with an architectural structure that is right in line with the sort of basilicas they built around that time. And so while they warn that they can't fully say that this is that church, they hope that in future years, as they continue to dig, that they will come across evidence. What they're really looking for is an inscription that says this church is dedicated to the memory of Peter and Andrew, and that this is built on their home. And they feel like if they find that, then that'll be the kind of evidence that lets them truly sort of put the issue to rest.
And I just mentioned, too, that, of course, I get the daily article and I printed it out, but then if you go to your website, and we have a link to denisonforum.org, people can see not only the article, but even that mosaic that you're talking about, because that's another clue. We don't want to, get too far ahead of the evidence. Archaeology takes time, and there's always a need for publishing and having people question, refute, or even confirm some of the ideas. But this, again, helps us understand this whole idea of church history. And one of the things I did not know until I read your article here is, was it in 725 A.D. you have this bishop that toured the Holy Land and reported seeing the church. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, his name is Bishop Willibald. He was born, I think, in Wessex, England, to a pretty influential family. Some say he's descendant from one of the regional kings in that area. But his father and his brother embarked upon a pilgrimage, which led them to Rome, and then his father ended up dying in Rome, but he and his brother continued on until he ended up going through the Holy Land and stopping across several historical sites and markers of graves of the St. John, and this church happens to be one of the things that he wrote about. And after his pilgrimage, he went and he became a monk at the Abbey of Monte Cassino. There was a Benedictine monastery there where he spent about 10 years, and his primary job was just instructing the monks there on everything that he saw in the Holy Lands, because at the time, the Holy Land was under Muslim occupation. And so pilgrimages through that region wasn't something that everyone could go and do. And so his reports were very valuable and provided a lot of insight that people otherwise wouldn't have access to.
It does answer a lot of questions, too, because if you think about this, I've thought about when Jesus was supposed to asked to feed the 5,000, he turns, interestingly enough, to Andrew and asks a question. And I've always sort of puzzled, why? Well, it turns out Andrew's from Bethsaida. In other words, he's saying, okay, in the nearby town, how much bread do you think is in there? Because he's really kind of setting up the miracle if you think about this. I don't want to overplay this too much, but by asking Andrew, that's his hometown. This is, of course, where the church, we think, was located. And so a lot of that makes sense as to why Jesus may have asked him that, because he's essentially saying, look, we can go to every bakery we got, but we don't have enough to feed these people right here. And that's, of course, Jesus helping them understand that this is going to be miraculous. And, of course, it is. And so the significance of finding this in his town is important. But tell us a little bit more, because one of your other sections of the article says, what does the Church of the Apostles matter to us today? And, you're getting your doctorate in church history. And I think it's important to recognize that if there's anything I'd like to do more of, it's to teach all of us church history, because we can learn some really important lessons from the past, can't we?
We absolutely can. And so much of what the past offers is encouragement for the present. And I feel like with this church especially, it brings to mind, in the article I talk about 3 basic points. How first, the discovery reminds us that we serve a God who's been worshipped faithfully for thousands of years. And sometimes I feel like it's easy for us to forget that and get so focused on our current time and our current worship that we forget that we lose sight of the fact that we worship the same God as the people we read about in Scripture. And we worship the same God as the people we hear about throughout the stories of our history. And there's a connection to them that I feel like impacts our worship and strengthens it and gives us a connection that can be really helpful when we get so focused on ourselves and our time that we lose sight of the bigger picture. Another way I think that the church can help is that it reminds us that persecution will come, but that we don't necessarily need to fear it. I mean, by the time Willibald walked by and saw this church, he was in Muslim-controlled lands. They had taken over Jerusalem around 638, and so when he comes by about 90 years later, even if there were still people worshiping that church, which isn't guaranteed, they were doing so under very different context than when it first started. And I think the other thing that can really be helpful is to remember that the only reason that the church mattered and that they felt the need to build the church at this location is because Peter and Andrew had been faithful to the calling they received from Christ. Their home wouldn't have mattered if they hadn't gone out and shared the gospel. But because they did, because they were faithful, generations and generations of believers followed them. And it gives us, I feel like that can give us also a bit of conviction and to go out and share our faith, and also just a bit of encouragement to remember that when we do, there's a long, long history that shows that our present trials, our present troubles, and any obstacles we may face are not stronger than the gospel. And I feel like that's one of the main things we can learn from history.
Let's take a break, and Ryan, I'll keep you on for just another minute or two because I wanted to talk about some of the resources available at the Denison Forum. and also just mention some of the other articles that you have written this week, and some on the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting, and that was very significant, as well as Joshua Harris, which actually Nick Pitts spent some time talking about on Tuesday, the idea of reuniting America. And given the fact that I got a feeling you'll be writing one for tomorrow, maybe we get a preview of that as well. So let's take a break and just, again, encourage you to, if you would like to read a little bit more about this, you can get my archaeology booklet. Just contact us at Point of View. And if you want to read this particular article about the ancient Church of the Apostles that might have been discovered, it's available at denisonforum.org. We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Ryan Dennison right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the great resources I would highly encourage you to subscribe to is the Daily Article, normally written by Dr. Jim Dennison, this week written by Ryan Dennison, and we have a link to the website denisonforum.org. And this week, Ryan, you've focused on the shooting in California. You've talked about Joshua Harris, an author and former pastor who said he renounces Christianity, and we pray for him. I've known his father for a very long time. He's been on the program since almost the first time I ever did this program. And then, of course, you have one on reuniting America, which is actually one by someone else that's posted there, a contributing article. But it's helpful to understand that every single day there are the daily articles. There are all sorts of other books and resources that are available. There's a podcast. And so talk just real briefly about some of the resources that people will find when they land on the website for denisonforum.org.
Sure, thank you. Every day we try and write a daily article that looks at whatever news is most of interest in the day, and I discuss that. And there's a lot of prayer that goes into which topics we choose, and I feel like God guides that process. And usually, what happens is usually the result is something that ends up being a very interesting way to look at the news from a biblical perspective. And that's what we strive to do with everything on our website. And not only do we focus on the news, though, we also have resources where we tackle tough faith questions. There's been several, we produce a book about every year called Biblical Insights into Tough Questions that tackles a lot of those issues as well. And so we try and provide a wide swath of resources that can help people not only grow in their faith, but then know how to live that faith out in the culture around them.
Might just mention that, of course, I just got your newsletter offering Volume 3 of Biblical Insights to Tough Questions, but you got Volumes 1 and 2 on the website right now. Of course, 7 Critical Issues. We've talked about that with your father podcast. I've had a chance to do that a few with your father, and I'm looking forward to having him on the program next week. Can you give us a preview of what we might be able to read tomorrow in the daily article?
Well, tomorrow's article, I'll be talking about Mario Lopez, who is one of the co-hosts for Access Hollywood. And recently some remarks have come out from an interview he did in June in which he talked about how it didn't really make sense to him that Hollywood celebrities would feel the need to let their children as young as 3 years old determine their own genders. And so he called that a dangerous idea and went into basically at no point even later on said that he thinks it's not that discussion shouldn't happen, but that it just shouldn't happen for later. So he wasn't even saying that transgender decisions such as that are wrong. He was just saying that they're wrong at such a young age, and he faced a lot of backlash for it, and recently came out and called and basically apologized for his comments. And so I take a look at that and basically just try and tackle the question of what do we do when it seems like we can't even have these discussions anymore?
Yeah. Again, the impact of the mob. And I've had that conversation with your father more than once. We'll probably have it with him next week. And as always, I look forward to the next daily article. So thank you for the preview, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Again, Ryan Dennison. Of course, as I mentioned, Jim Dennison will be with us next week for a segment, so we'll be talking with him then. And just before we run out of time, let's see if I can cover 2 issues, one in California, one in Maryland. Let's take California first. If you have not seen, the latest challenge to Donald Trump is coming from California because on Tuesday, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, signed a law that would bar Donald Trump from the state primary ballot unless he discloses his tax returns. Now, first of all, I think he should release his tax returns, but there's a bigger issue here, and that is Democrats are actually trying to keep a sitting president from running for re-election in the state. Now, if you think about this for a minute, Kelly Shackelford won't be with us tomorrow, but I would love to if he were here because his head would explode because you're saying, wait a minute, the Constitution does have something to say about this, and that is that if you actually meet the constitutional requirements of age, citizenship, and residency, you have to be on the ballot. States can evaluate all sorts of other things, but the Constitution makes it pretty clear. And you don't have to take my word for it. How about the previous governor of the state of California? Again, you're not going to hear me say too many positive things about the former governor of California, Jerry Brown, but Jerry Brown had the opportunity to actually sign that bill and vetoed it in 2017. And he had 2 very good arguments, which I agree with both of them. First of all, it may not be constitutional because you are violating the requirements set forth in the Constitution. But the second argument he makes is that it's a slippery slope, and I agree with that as well. Imagine if you were to say, well, the states can require certain documents before we'll put you on the ballot. Does anybody remember the real controversy about whether or not we have a valid birth certificate for Barack Obama? Could you imagine a state saying, we will not put Barack Obama on the ballot until we see a valid birth certificate? And that's, of course, exactly what Jerry Brown said. Today, we require tax returns, but what would be next? 5 years of health records, a certified birth certificate, health school report cards. And, I just got to love the fact that he understands that. And I say to my liberal friends so many times, yeah, you love the outcome until that very same principle could be used against you. And we have all sorts of ways in which that principle could indeed be used against you. So I don't think it's going to stand the constitutional test, but we will find out. And at the moment, trying to bring some pressure on the president to release his tax returns. And if he does, then the state of California put him on the ballot. I got a feeling that one's going to be struck down even by the Ninth Circuit Court. Let's go to the state of Maryland, and in particular Baltimore. You've been following, of course, the back and forth between President Donald Trump and Democratic Representative Elijah Cummings. Of course, you've heard all the statements being made about all sorts of individuals in the past, including he and others that have talked about some of the problems in the state. But I thought it was kind of interesting to see the back and forth between two African Americans. One, the Housing and Urban Development Secretary, Ben Carson, who's black, and was a pediatric neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins living in Baltimore, and, of course, Elijah Cummings. And so just the other day on one of the interviews, Ben Carson, former Dr. Ben Carson, former pediatrician and pediatric neurosurgeon, said, I've spent a good chunk of my life in Baltimore. It's a sad city. I think it's a city with a lot of promise. He went on to say, first of all, as a pediatric neurosurgeon, I spent many hours operating all night long trying to save children of Baltimore and other places around the country, giving them a second chance at life. And he says, I've seen some really difficult situations. He went on, by the way, to say, I don't think Elijah Cummings is a bad person. I actually think he's working hard to try to help people. And so he wasn't really critical of Elijah Cummings. So Ben Carson invited Congressman Elijah Cummings to tour a HUD facility with him in Baltimore. You know where we're going? He asked him to come, and when the press conference began and all the reporters noticed that Ben Carson was there and Elijah Cummings was not, again, you got to love Ben Carson. He says, if nothing else, maybe it was a scheduling conflict. But nevertheless, that is the case. And it was, I think, illustrative of the fact that there are individuals who, because of their integrity, can rise above that. And I want to give kudos to somebody I've known and had my picture taken with and interacted with a little bit over the years, Ben Carson. And in the midst of that back and forth, it was nice to see somebody with some integrity, with some quality, and with some desire to try to heal some wounds do so, but didn't seem to work. Well, tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition, and I got a feeling we just have a lot of things that I've still got on the table here that we haven't covered, so we will cover those tomorrow. If you'd like to know a little bit more about the Denison Forum, if you'd like to know a little bit more about the Democrat debates, all available at our website, pointofview.net. Want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.